Moscow marks Victory Day. President Putin blames the West for the war in Ukraine and says his troops are fighting for the motherland. But was this the celebration Putin envisioned 3 months after invading Ukraine? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Russia's Victory Day celebration. It's Russia's biggest and most prestigious public holiday, and this year's May 9th celebrations hold even more significance for Moscow. The massive military parade marks the Soviet Union's victory over the Nazis in World War II. And today, the Kremlin says it's fighting a similar battle in Ukraine, claiming it's trying to denazify the nation. Now, the rhetoric has been prominent throughout the conflict, and it was no different in Moscow's Red Square. Here's Russian President Vladimir Putin.
We will never give up our love for the motherland, our faith and traditional values, our ancestral customs, our respect for all peoples and cultures. In the West, they seem to have decided to cancel these millennia-old values. This moral degradation has become the basis for cynical falsifications of the history of the Second World War. You are fighting for the homeland, for its future, so that no one forgets the lessons of the Second World War, so that there is no place in the world for executioners, punishers, and Nazis.
Parades took place in many cities across Russia. Thousands of service members marched through Moscow next to tanks, while hundreds of military aircraft flew above. Now, prior to the parade, many were expecting President Putin to make a major announcement, but that never came. When Russia launched its assault on Ukraine, many thought victory would be swift, given the size of the Russian military. But 3 months later, the fighting continues, and largely credited for keeping Kiev in that fight is, of course, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The former actor and comedian became the face of Ukraine's resistance, and in his speech, he vowed to defeat Russia and accused Moscow of recreating Nazi atrocities.
During the 2 years of occupation, the Nazis killed 10,000 civilians there. In 2 months of occupation, Russia killed 20,000. Decades after World War II, darkness returned to Ukraine, and it became black and white again. Again, evil has returned, again in a different uniform, under different slogans, but for the same purpose. A bloody reconstruction of Nazism was organized in Ukraine, a fanatical repetition of this regime.
Well, NATO says the conflict could drag on for years. Let's take a look at some of the key moments in the war so far.
In December, satellite images show Russian forces amassing at the border of Ukraine. Moscow says it wants security guarantees from the West, including assurances Kiev will never join NATO. On February 10th, Russia and Belarus begin a 10-day joint military exercise close to the Ukrainian border. 11 days later, President Vladimir Putin recognizes the independence of the self-proclaimed Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republic and orders what he calls peacekeeping forces to the region. Then, on February the 24th, Russian forces enter Ukraine.
Мы будем стремиться к демилитаризации и денацификации Украины, а также преданию суду тех, кто совершил многочисленные кровавые преступления против мирных жителей, в том числе и граждан Российской Федерации.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky vows to stay in the country and fight. On March the 2nd, the UN General Assembly votes to condemn Russia's attack. The following day, Kherson, the first major city, falls to Russian forces. And on March the 12th, the Kremlin takes control of Bucha. A month later, Ukrainian forces retake the city just north of the capital. Kiev uncovers mass graves and accuses Moscow of massacring innocent civilians.
Це військові злочини, і це буде визнано світом як геноцид. Те, що ви сьогодні тут знаходитесь, бачите, що відбулось. Ми знаємо тисячі людей вбитих і закатованих з відрубаними кінцівками, зґвалтовані жінки, вбиті діти. Я думаю, що це більше, ніж це і є геноцид.
By the middle of April, Russia had refocused its efforts to the eastern Donbass region. It wasn't long before they were claiming victory in Mariupol, but Kiev said the fight wasn't over. And just one day before Russia's Victory Day parade, Ukraine announces all women, children, and the elderly had been evacuated from the Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol.
Let's talk further then about Victory Day, what was expected and what was delivered. Joining me now from Moscow is Sergey Utkin, the head of the Strategic Assessment section at the Primakov Institute of World Economy and International Relations. Peter Eltsov is in Raleigh, North Carolina. He's an international security studies professor at the National Defense University. And Aglaya Snetkov is a lecturer in the international politics of Russia at University College London. Thanks all so much for joining us. You know, repeatedly, we'd heard mention of May 9th as even a deadline of sorts, or at least marking a day that would better define what Russia has done and what it will do in Ukraine. Instead, we got this rather anticlimactic speech from President Putin in which he didn't even declare this a war. It's still this special operation. Aglaya, were you expecting something bigger?
Honestly, no. But I think became very difficult to say that because I think there was a lot of expectation placed upon a lot of pundits to say something about. Putin has never liked to make big pronouncements. So most actual experts talked about the possibility that we might see something, but a lot of people did try to dampen it down. But I think that sort of there was a momentum created whereby we wanted to see a marker in the sand and to try and gauge a little bit better about what Putin is going to do. And in the end, we kind of saw nothing.
Right. I mean, well, some analysts I spoke to really thought May 9th would be a marker in his overall strategy, that he was building toward it because he wanted to be able to celebrate some sort of victory, and that it was factored in almost from the beginning of this operation. Do you think that was exaggerated or overplayed then from the beginning?
So I think he might have factored it in back in February when the expectation was this was going to be a quick, painless war. The minute it turned out that it wasn't going to be, and I think that, you know, Putin, as over the course of his presidency, he has never liked to make pronouncements. He always likes to sit on the fence, and he likes to keep his options open. A big announcement such as, you know, on the 9th of May would have been very symbolic and very uncharacteristic of Putin. But I appreciate that we're all interested in finding out what is going to happen. And therefore, we place sort of these expectations on these developments, you know, the taking of Mariupol, the taking of Kyiv, you know, 9th of May, in order to understand what's going on.
Right. Sergey, you know, this was actually what you were expecting, in that Putin used the date to again draw the parallels between the Second World War, you know, the Soviets defeating the Nazis, and the conflict with Ukraine, fighting fascists again today, as he sees it. And he did do that. But wasn't it just, you know, more of what he's been saying since the beginning?
Aglaya just said it all. I think we indeed couldn't expect realistically that this specific date would mean much more than it did in previous years. It is a national holiday, actually, maybe the only true national holiday on the part of the New Year celebrations, something that people take dearly to their hearts because of their family histories, because of the generations that fought in this war and that still mean a lot to the people who live in the country today. But this connection with what's happening in Ukraine these days is, of course, a completely different matter. And whatever you hear from Putin at this speech at the parade, it's not what people think about in families when they mark this holiday. They reflect upon the fates of their grandfathers, grand-grandfathers. They care about that and not about what you could hear in his speech. And indeed, in what he said, he just repeated things that you heard from him before. If he had other plans back a couple of months about this military operation is an open question. Probably we will learn more from memoirs.
Let me ask you, though, Sergey, do you think it went well overall for Putin today? I mean, there was already a sense of nationalism, we know, among especially his supporters. Was there a boost in that nationalism as a result of this speech today and the celebrations of May 9th?
I think what most people expected was the kind of celebration that they remember from previous years. So there's an established tradition of how you mark this day. And frankly, the message to most of the Russians is not the one of mobilization or like change your lives and start doing it differently because of the war in Ukraine. No, the message is on the contrary, do what you always did. Don't protest, support the government, but not like actively, but just express your support if you ask to. But this is the message more or less. And that means that things that happened in a certain way in previous years should still happen in this way also this year. And this is what is happening with this Victory Day.
Okay, so stay the course. Peter, let me ask you, I mean, was there anything particularly significant about what Putin said today? Was there anything kind of additional that we could read a little more into beyond a basic victory speech?
I don't think he said anything new. He basically repeated the same story that Ukraine is basically part of Russia, that he is fighting allegedly the neo-Nazi. I find it's very sad, shameful, and pathetic because I think he definitely expected to declare victory on this day. And we helped him to think that way because the US intelligence and Western intelligence grossly miscalculated because we ourselves, if you remember before the war, were saying that the Russian army would be in 3 days in Kyiv. It was the same type of intelligence miscalculation what happened in Afghanistan. And of course, fortunately, it didn't happen. The Ukrainians showed incredible resilience. Now we are helping them much more. And for Putin, there was nothing really to say today. I mean, he's losing the war. There is no question in anyone's mind, even if he manages to hold on some part of the Ukrainian territory, he's not going to get anything what he wanted to get.
But I mean, how is that losing if he gets the territory that he was initially after, particularly in Donbass?
He wanted to change the government in Kyiv. He wanted to have this parade possibly in Kyiv on Krещатик. So none of that happened. In 2 months of war, except for Kherson, no big city is fully controlled, and maybe Mariupol, if you can call it control, and still not fully controlled. Even Kharkiv and Sumy, which are completely populated by the Russian speakers, are not controlled. So it's a complete disaster from his perspective. It's very, very little achieved comparatively to what was planned initially. So to save the face, he is repeating the same things about Ukraine and fighting the neo-Nazi, when in reality, he's behaving himself as I don't want to use these comparisons, but yes, as like a fascist government, basically annexing the territory of another land. So
let me come back to Sergey quickly. Being in Moscow, being Russian yourself, I mean, it's saying this, that, Putin is losing this war. So many analysts have said it has not gone the way he's wanted to, and he will not win the way he'd set out to win. Tell us, if that really is the case, why has his popularity effectively risen? More and more Russians, from what we're hearing, are actually in support of this war. Is that just a normal universal trend where when a government goes to war, the support rallies no matter what?
Well, you have different people living in the country, and if you ask me, I think that this war in itself is a disaster that makes things way more difficult and problematic for Russia itself. But Putin still claims that the goals that he declared, they are still relevant. And in spite of the fact that, yes, people ascribe to him all sorts of maximalistic plans that he could have in the beginning of that, by now you see that things are indeed more complicated. Whether he's still able to declare that things are going in the right direction and have popular support for that, I think given the total control over the state media, this is in principle possible because it's mostly not about what's happening, but about how you pack it. If you explain to the people that, well, the whole idea was to reduce the Ukrainian military capacity, and of course it is reduced, that you had to make sure that the security zone in the area where you had all those Donbas fights is enlarged, that there is more protection for people who live there. A lot of those who believe Putin, they will just buy it if this is the narrative provided by the state media.
Okay. Aglaya, I can see you agree with both Sergey and Peter's analyses there, but let me ask you this. Looking at today and the Victory Day, May 9th, you know, Russia deeply believes Moscow was on the right side of history throughout and really after World War II. And Putin is fixated on never forgetting that. But do Russians still believe it is relevant, you know, almost 80 years later? Because no other allied nation seems to be consumed in the same way Russia is with their victorious history.
So I think we have to sort of unpack that question. So when it comes to Putin, and even let's say my generation, so I'm in my 40s, they have a direct connection. You know, Putin's brother died during the siege of Leningrad. My grandmother was in the siege of Leningrad. Especially for Putin, living and growing up in Leningrad, it's relevant. It's absolutely relevant. It is relevant to generation above me, so to my parents, and even to a generation like myself. Like, I remember the parades in Soviet Union in 1990, let's say I was 10, but I watched them. So it's relevant. But I think it's important to remember that increasingly to anyone younger than myself who doesn't even remember Soviet Union properly, it's not. It is not relevant. The only way it is relevant, and where it is relevant, is that Victory Day is, for Putin, the sort of the grounding moment when Russia was almost born, right? It's sort of the moment in history that shows that Russia is always on the right side of history. And it's the commemorative day the Russians do go back to. As Sergey said, you know, apart from the New Year's Eve, New Year's Day, right? It's the one thing we can hold on to, that we all have something in common and that, you know, everyone sort of celebrates. But I think, and I mean, I did leave Russia a long time ago. I think for younger people, it is increasingly irrelevant. And I think that's why it's important that Putin's speech, so much of it was about convincing the Russian audience that there was actually a rationale for going in. And that's what the focus of the speech was. The focus wasn't on nukes or declaring victory. It was on trying to explain to the Russians why it is that they're going to be under sanctions for years to come. It was basically to say we were under threat, there was no choice. Because for anyone under 40, I'm not sure that they are going to understand why they're going to go back, economically speaking, potentially to a period of the 1990s, if not before. And that's going to be the biggest problem for Putin, and the biggest problem of sort of using Victory Day as a justification for sort of the war in Ukraine, because, you know, how long can the regime hold on when economically things are going to get a lot worse?
You know, Peter, I mean, he's really only now characterizing this as a necessary preemptive action. In the lead up, you know, Russia kept repeating that it would only invade if attacked. Then when they attacked first, you know, weeks later, they came out and said, oh, well, we discovered Ukrainian plans to invade Donbas, so we had no choice. Does the Russian public believe that now? Have they been convinced that even though this was a preemptive action, they will be on the right side of history?
You know, I don't know where you take these numbers that he's so popular. yes, people support him, but I think we don't have the exact picture how many people support him. There is clearly at least 15-20%, and that's like 30 million people who vehemently oppose him. And that's a very significant power in the country. If you look at the public figures, celebrities, writers, journalists, tens of thousands of them fled Russia now. The situation is horrid. And I don't
Sure,
think that
we all understand the country is divided. I mean, we can only go by certain polls we've seen. We have seen certain polls that say, you know, he got this bump in this nationalist rhetoric, and people are suddenly kind of rallying behind him just because they feel there needs to be a sense of unity in the face of war. But regardless, we know that's debatable. We can't really know because polls are always flawed, and there's no way to really poll the Russian people objectively. Go ahead.
I think the reality is that there is this, in the middle, a large amount of people, as Aglaya said, who are a younger generation, don't remember the Soviet Union, are not traced with these ideas. And I don't think they care that much. And I think their allegiance can switch immediately overnight when they will realize the effect of sanctions, when they will see all of that. And I don't believe very much in the future of Russia. I think Putin has destroyed, this is the biggest mistake, if you can say, of his life and miscalculation. Instead of reducing NATO, now Finland and Sweden may join NATO. And I think this alleged support of the Russian people may evaporate very, very quickly, given the historical circumstances.
Okay, Peter, let me ask you then quickly, though, because, you know, is the wider world now arguably on the right side of history by standing against Russia, inadvertently making Russia stronger by allowing Putin to say from inside Russia, see, everyone is against us, but we understand ourselves and we will stand up for what's right as Russians?
I don't think so. I think there is also a very big question here is the nationality issues. Aside from this, what I said, 20% who don't support him, there are like also Tatars, Chechens, the Ingush people. And these people has no patriotic feelings towards Russia. And a lot of them are actually fighting in Ukraine. That's why the morale is so low. That's why the generals are being killed, because it's unprecedented that the generals have to go to the front line to boost the morale of the Russian army. I don't believe that the Russian people will buy this propaganda saying that the West wants to destroy Russia, wants to take it apart. If Russia collapses, it's only going to be due to what Putin and his government are doing to the country.
But Sergey, let me ask you, I mean, we're hearing, you know, how morale is falling apart, that Putin has made these massive mistakes, but NATO is now saying that this could just drag on for years.
Yes, I think it can drag on, and actually, in what I just heard, I see quite a lot of, wishful thinking on the part of Putin's opponents. I mean, I agree that this was a disaster, but can he still promote his case further and have support for it? I think he can, objectively speaking, whether we like it or not. And this is because in the population, you do have certain understanding. Maybe it's hard to assess in terms of opinion polls, but still you have certain understanding for the anti-Western narrative. So people have kind of feeling that it was probably not very just that the West won the Cold War and we lost, and we somehow must make sure that we are still a great power. And if the Americans go to Iraq, why cannot we? So this is the kind of the kind of discourse that quite a lot of people are ready to buy, including the younger people. So you don't need necessarily to have this Soviet experience to agree that your country is kind of destined to be a great power and someone is impeding it to become one. And whether whether this runs out of fuel, this discourse, is indeed a very interesting question. But I think for next months and even years, this will not happen, that there will be enough those who will just say, well, if the president says so, the president gets all the information, we should just believe him.
Aglaya, very quickly, last 30 seconds. I mean, NATO, if they do believe this can continue for years, and it does indeed continue for years, I mean, to what end?
We don't know. And I think the reality is, I would agree that with Sergey, that just because Victory Day is less relevant doesn't mean that the Russian public isn't going to be apathetically essentially focusing inwards, which is what they've been doing for the last 20, 30 years, right? Is focusing inwards and focusing on their own life, which is going to get harder. I think the war can continue indefinitely. Well, not indefinitely, but for a long time. We don't know what the end result will be, either from the point of view of what the Russians will expect from the Ukrainians, and crucially, in view of the Western support of Ukraine and Ukraine's ability to fight the Russians, what the Ukrainians are going to be willing to accept, right?
Okay.
We're now talking about both sides having to sort of negotiate.
Right. Aglaya, we're going to have to leave it there. Very unfortunately, we're out of time for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us. And our viewers, of course, as well. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.